Thank you, Professor Robbins, Ambassador Sheeran, and the Asia Society for hosting me here for a second time. It's wonderful to come back here and engage with people who have been great friends of Afghanistan and students of Afghanistan, and we all are. Last time I was here, I left here, and things that Barney said were happened, let's say. But I want to say what it is that I had been focusing in the past, for the past year, as the National Security Advisor, about thinking about how do we end this conflict. First, from personal experience on what we experienced, what happened as we were growing up in this conflict, and how it came this far. And then looking at it from an institutional perspective on what do we do to end it. There is one conflict in Afghanistan, and that is the Afghan conflict. But there are multiple dimensions to that conflict. We have the internal dimensions in the internal dynamics of power, people fighting for power and the way they think that that country should be run. But then there are grievances that are much more local, that have been generated over the past 20 years at least, and the 4 decades that we have had the different versions of this conflict ongoing. And then there is the economic aspect of it. The drug economy that many of you know has been at the center of this conflict. And then the proxy wars that we so often talk about, those countries who have been using Afghanistan as a platform for their own objectives, either in Afghanistan or by fighting their wars in our country so that they don't have to on their own. And this proxy war perhaps is the one most dangerous. From the perspective of fighting the war, we have no issues. Afghans are ready to defend their nation. Every day I meet with our security forces. I meet with them on the battlefield. I meet with them in the hospitals after they have been injured, and I meet with their family members. They never regret that they are where they are. Even those who are injured, critically injured, and they tell me that they would go back out there the minute they're better enough to be able to stand on their 2 feet so that they can continue to defend their country. It's very clear to them what they're doing and why they are there. And that sacrifice means the protection of what we have as a land and as a people and as a culture. But when it comes to the political aspect of it, that's when it gets complicated. I reacted to certain things that were happening when I was here last, and the reason was that most of our issues are actually institutional. It's the continuation of institutions that will be able to provide the solutions that we need, and that is peace. Peace will come, but it may not be at a distant negotiating table. Peace will come in much more smaller steps, and we see it every day. I'll give you examples, a few examples from our security forces alone. We were, as you know, a dependent security force, mostly dependent on the United States financial help, but also on technical help, on advisory, and also on their other capabilities that came with it. We don't need it as much anymore. The most dependent force in our security apparatus is the commandos and the special forces in the police, the different kinds of special forces we have. We have the crisis response units in the police. We also have the commandos who do operations in the military. And the dependency that I can quote from this year, 1,057 operations by the commandos. Only 4% of those operations were conducted with the help of our international partners. Right? Only 4%. In the special forces that the police have, and that is largely when an attack happens and they go out to clear, 8% of the support came from outside. And they have averted some of the most difficult attacks. Right? Those of you who remember the Mumbai attacks and on Taj Hotel, it took days to clear. We have that. Unfortunately, we have had that on a monthly basis, and every time an attack happens, within a few hours, the CRUs clear those on their own. The institutions that have been built are doing the job that they needed to do, and that is to bring stability, to make it harder for anybody to bring violence to our country, and to clear areas that are taken by insurgents and their terrorist friends who would like to harm you and others outside of Afghanistan. And that institutional support and that institutional development has been as a result of many sacrifices, both by Afghans and our international partners, particularly the United States, who have had, as a country, the most casualties after the Afghans. And we are at a stage where we now are able to conduct these operations, clear our country, and hold them on our own. Right? To give all of that up so we can start all over again is where we think that we go wrong. And that is why we have strong reaction to when people talk about creating interim setups in Afghanistan. A lot of our conflict has always been the continuation of power. We have finally figured out a system now. Democracy was Afghan, but it came with the help of our international partners. And now it has come to a stage where we are comfortable in dealing with it. It is working. We have a method of continuation of power and transfer of power, and we would like to keep it. And we think that that's the best peace plan ever, to have institutions that are able to deliver rule of law, governance, and security to our people, and are able to defend our country and all of those who have helped us build this system from terrorists who would like to cause us all harm. And that is what I think we are going to focus on post these elections in Afghanistan. Once a new government is formed, peace is going to be a top priority. But what we mean by peace may not be exactly what everybody thinks. It's not going to be a simple negotiations with those Taliban who want to have a political settlement. It's going to mean that we strengthen our security forces, we clear areas that are controlled by transnational criminal groups and are acting as political actors. We are going to clear areas and make it harder for those who are using Afghanistan for their international drug smuggling and other kind of criminal activities. And we're going to improve governance in areas where people have been driven to the arms of the Taliban as a result of the incapacity or the corruption in the system that we currently have. So it's going to be a multitude of those actions. In addition to that, we work with our neighbors to make it easier for them to come to terms with the new Afghanistan and work with them to address their grievances, because this conflict, as I said, has both internal and external elements. That said, I'll stop here and happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Sheeran.
Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to our trustee, Denise Saul, and all our guests this afternoon. We've all survived UN week, which was very intense, so the traffic's gone down a little at least, but we're so pleased to have you here. I know you know the United States very well, and it's a time when understanding the U.S. and its relationship to Afghanistan is so important in your role. You voted. Can you hold up your finger?
I did.
Yes.
I did. It's starting to come off now, but yes.
Yeah, I found your remarks really hopeful, and you are using words like peace will come and the new Afghanistan. Tell me what is your main source of hope, and you seem to feel that these elections will prove that democracy's really taken root.
We live in bubbles.
Mm-hmm.
We all live in our own bubbles. People who are looking at Afghanistan from outside or mainly rely on sources of journalists writing about the country or Afghans commenting, without realizing that most of these people are sitting in their own bubbles. and are only looking at what they see, and those whose predominant source of this information is social media forget that the algorithms only show you what you're interested in, and forget the other parts of what the discourse that may be happening. My source of inspiration comes from visiting our troops, visiting our people in the provinces, and talking to them. Every time I visit, I get more hopeful. My last visit was to Yangam district in Badakhshan, a very remote area that was recently taken back from the Taliban. And talking to the people there and what they lived under when the Taliban were in their rule and what their aspirations were. Everybody talks about Taliban control. They forget that Taliban control means Taliban intimidation. And there is no rule. No country would be allowed, or the international community would like to see the kind of intimidation that they live under. And what our forces were able to do with very little help from outside, outside of the forces that were already present in that province. And also seeing how our institutions have evolved and developed. If I was to draw a bell curve, we had a difficult start from the beginning when the U.S. came to Afghanistan and started helping us rebuild. We had no infrastructure, no electricity. We had very little human resources to help rebuild. We had no engineers, no doctors, no hospitals. You had to go up to a neighboring country to make a phone call, and that's where we started with. Today,
I remember seeing that, yeah.
So it was a very hard and steep beginning, and I think very tiresome for many as well. But we are right at the top right now, where we're going to start sliding down. We have human resources. We have development. If the electricity cuts off so much so for a night, everybody starts complaining. Forget the dark days where there was no electricity. We have roads, we have infrastructure, and we have an economy that is growing each day. And we're rooting out corruption. The rule of the strong man is evaporating. Institutions are taking roots in place. So I look at all those steps that have been taken and are finally coming to has either matured or are maturing, is what gives me inspiration and hope that we have a better Afghanistan to look to.
We'll come to the audience in about 20 minutes and for questions that come online. But just to continue for a moment with the positive streak here, what gives me tremendous hope is meeting the next generation of emerging leaders in Afghanistan. Asia Society honored the Afghanistan girls robotics team at our Game Changers event last year. We then brought them to Silicon Valley and honored them in California. I mean, they are rock stars, but most importantly, they're completely believing in their own future, their own capacity, and I've been struck really by the creativity of this generation. They're entrepreneurial, they're starting businesses, cafes, where they have the opportunity, where there's enough security to do so. And I get the sense that they're not ready to allow anyone to take their destiny.
Absolutely. I think that team you met is a generation that has only known democracy. That's interesting. In it, they grew up or were born. My generation, we were born in a war. We grew up with war. They have only known democracy, and they're also a testament to what having a stable education can do. So, as they were coming of age to go to school, there were schools for them to go to. They had they were getting access to the internet. And today, I've met those girls when they first came to Washington. I was the ambassador, and I have to say, my first experience with them was I was worried that there was a lot of media outside, and I thought most of these girls are coming outside, coming to a country outside for the first time. I don't have time to prep them to talk to the media. And when they started talking as if they had been preparing all their life.
They're pros.
They were pros. And that is the Afghanistan that has come off. And that is what the Afghanistan we're fighting to preserve. people to be able to make their own future and have the capacity that they're capable of put to the use of serving their country.
So after 9/11, as you pointed out, the U.S. and Afghanistan joined in a vast effort to try to stabilize and rebuild and de-radicalize the country. This has been the longest war in U.S. history, overseas war. It has cost thousands of lives on both sides. It's cost hundreds of billions of dollars. And I have never felt a bigger sense of fatigue on the U.S. side or the Afghanistan side. You said peace will come, and that certainly seems the demand of the moment and the mood of the country. Do you worry about this fatigue, the fact that there isn't that appetite to keep up that hard struggle, or are we entering a time when now this will naturally evolve into a more stable type of situation?
Worried is a strong word. I'm not worried, but definitely concerned.
It's the weakest word being used in New York during Unga Week. There's been a lot more threatening words flying around the world in all sorts of zones, but yeah.
Well, I'm not worried, but I'm definitely concerned. Right? If the U.S. was to say and leave today, we will have difficulties paying our security forces. We have much to build before that happens. But if we were given a timeline, a responsible timeline, we can prepare. And we had a previous timeline that was 2024 when we had our self-reliance timeline prepared for, and that is when we were thinking about the different actions that we needed to take so that we could get to a point where we could at least operationally sustain ourselves, if not development-wise. And we had to expedite that. And like I said, it is a bell curve. Now, we are at the peak of it, and going from here will probably be a lot easier than when we started from the rubble. We're not at the rubble now. We have what we need to be able to sustain what we've built together, and we're committed to holding it. Now, when you talk about peace, for most Afghans, peace means an end to the conflict, an end to violence, so that we can go to weddings and not worry about Taliban or ISIS blowing the hall up, or go to mosque and offer condolences to our relatives when someone passes away and not worry that mosque would be blown up by the Taliban. So, for us, peace means an end to violence, right? Now, when we talk about a peace deal, we're definitely thinking about that. That is the main. Perhaps those who are negotiating are also thinking in those terms, but maybe violence is not everything to them. And for us, that is not acceptable. Right? If we are thinking about what kind of an Afghanistan we live in and the compromises we're prepared to make, should we have to reintegrate or integrate some of the insurgents, the violence must go. That is the main red line of the fact. That's how we will define peace. Well, that's how those who are living in areas stricken by violence define peace. But it also means that we have stability. We can start doing the very small things that everybody else does, that all the other countries can plan. Certainty is one of those. People in the last year had been putting everything on hold, including investments. People are not buying houses, not selling them. They don't know what's going to happen in the next year. What would it mean? Do they have to evacuate the country because there is going to be a return of the Taliban? And what would the return of the Taliban mean? Others are preparing and forming alliances so that they may have to resist that. What we mean by peace is the end of grievances too. So we end the violence, but we also end the grievances. And as I said in my remarks today at the UN General Assembly, there will be no peace until all of Afghans live in peace, right? Every single one of them. And for us to achieve that, We think it's a doable objective. But to come back to your main question, and that is the fatigue, we understand that the U.S., there is fatigue with the war in Afghanistan, and but you certainly are perhaps not open, or the visibility of how fatigued the Afghans are of this war too. We want an end to it, but there has to be a way to end it, and without completely surrendering to those who have been threatening us for the past 2 decades and what it would come to. That there is a path that we need to work out together. We are thankful to the support that the United States has provided us, and like I said, we don't want to lose it. The gains we've made in the last 2 decades have put us on a path that will lead to the stability that our country needs. And we can take the rest of the road on our own should we have to.
What in the current Doha talks or whatever will follow in Norway or Camp David was paused makes you use the words complete surrender?
The Taliban said they don't want to talk to the Afghan government. First of all, it's wrong. The Taliban have sat down and talked to the Afghan government when they had to. The first surrender was accepting that as if it was an okay thing to do.
Accepting
that the Taliban saying they don't want to talk to them. Well, it's not up to them. If they want to live in this country, and if they want to be able to be included in whatever arrangement there is in the future, they have to talk to the Afghan government.
What was the explanation you were given on that, what you call the first surrender, by the U.S.? What is your understanding of the decision to not include the government?
Well, I think I wasn't part of the decision-making process on what could have been, but I think it may have been led by more domestic reasons in the U.S. To want to expedite this process. Just like you said, there is fatigue with the war in Afghanistan, and the government or the administration thought that is the easiest way out. This is what the Taliban want. Let's give that to them, and hopefully they will follow. The next steps would be easier. Without, like I said, this was not going to deliver the peace that the Afghan people thought of. In this version, we also had the risk of going to a civil war, because the Afghans who had been fighting were out of this, and that is the Afghan security forces. We have had 150,000 casualties in the last 20 years. And those people are not insignificant. They have families, they are in this country. And in that, plus everybody else who have committed themselves to this freedom and life. In 2001, when the U.S. arrived in Afghanistan, the Afghans were completely isolated from the outside world. I mean, we had been in conflict for 30 years. Like I said, you had to go to the neighboring country to make a phone call. There was no electricity, there was no infrastructure. It was an abandoned country, abandoned by its own people. Kabul was a ghost town, almost a ghost town. It's not that anymore, and these people have a say.
So that was what you call the first surrender, and you were about to touch on the second surrender.
Well, the surrender would be to give up on the institutions that we've built together. Right? The security forces won, but all the other democratic institutions that we have built, were not perfect. I would never term what we have as perfect, but they are headed to what we are trying to establish, and that was institutions that are citizen-centric, that are delivering to its people, and have a rule of law, an equal rule of law for all. We are getting to a point now where we are collecting more and more revenue each day, and it's not because our revenue is growing, it's because we're reducing the leakages that were previously going to corruption and other ways where people were dodging to pay their taxes. Now they are paying, so our revenue is growing. We are also rebuilding our history, re-establishing our identity, right? All on our own without any help from the outside.
So what in this agreement makes you feel that those institutions are being abandoned?
Well, there was no discussion of the institutions, one. And the other most important part is we're not at the table. The institutions have a hierarchy. There is a government in place, and that government is not at the table.
So your point is the structure of these negotiations is not recognizing the legitimate role of these institutions. Is there more surrenders, or the two?
No. I think we are in a very good place right now. We can evaluate what happened in the last 9 months, see what we can rescue and salvage, and have a consultation with our international partners and our neighbors on the way forward. And we think that there is enough consensus in Afghanistan to have peace and reconcile those Taliban who are willing to accept a political deal. So there is an internal consensus, and our elections have happened. There is more certainty on that front. There is a lot that we can learn from the last 9 months on how negotiations went. We can also see the anxieties that happen, and many things happened in the last 9 months. We have had jirgas that have established the red lines. People have started discussing what is important to them. Before these discussions began, the Constitution was just a piece of paper. Nobody cared. And suddenly people started caring for the Constitution and the Republic. People started realizing their values and livelihoods are tied to this. So it has become much more serious. I think we are now at the cusp of a real discourse on peace. And as a government, we're committed to taking this opportunity to make that happen.
So I'm going to come to the audience after 2 more questions. It's very intriguing that in the election Saturday, even though there was concern about fraud and concern that there would again be a stalemate between the leading candidates, that there wasn't the anger that was there in 2014. And part of what your delegation has explained to me was the use of biometrics to help reduce fraud in the elections. I know the power of biometrics to dramatically reduce fraud. And when you say we're seeing more taxes paid, we're seeing less fraud, I think people tend to be skeptical. But are you using new tools such as that to make sure that you can identify people and their responsibilities to a government and their responsibilities to revenue? Is that a similar story to the elections? And could you explain what happened in the elections?
This perhaps was the best elections from a technical perspective in Afghanistan. And what is interesting is it was the elections that the Afghans were in more control of. Right? We had support, some financial support and some other assistance during, for security preparations. But it was the elections that we paid for, we technically prepared for, and we secured. And technically, again, the best election. Security-wise, we were able to avert most of the attacks that were intended. The Taliban, it's not that the Taliban did not try. They tried 273 times, 73 attacks around the city to disrupt. But we were able to prevent those and the ones that didn't actually happen. So there were issues with the election previously. Fraud was one of the main concerns, and perhaps one of the reasons our turnout was low, because people didn't believe that it would produce a result. We introduced a lot of measures to prevent them. First of all, people had to register, and their IDs were verified, so their national ID were verified and registered into a voter list. Now, those voter lists were then tied to specific polling centers where they had to go. So there was a limit at each polling center, and people had to vote in that place. Then we introduced the biometric devices, so the voter list had to match with the data on the device. They had to put use their fingerprints to for verification and access, and a picture of their ID card and a picture of the person, so that the person actually exists and is not just a ghost. All of those were to add additional measures to ensure that we have no fraud, plus the timestamps, because in the past boxes were filled at night and not on the day. Now the devices can measure when a person voted and what date that was voted on. So we can prevent all of those from fraud. Now, it did create some issues because people who weren't registered showed up and didn't have their names on the registration list. People who have new digital ID cards didn't have to register, but they didn't know that they had to put themselves on the voter list, and they weren't on the voters list. We had some technical issues, but overall, women in conservative areas complained and didn't vote because their photo had to be taken and they weren't. There was no exception to that. So we did have some technical issues on that front too. But overall, the main concern that was fraud was averted with this process.
And just a last question before we go to the audience. President Trump said last week in his speech to the UN General Assembly that the U.S. wants to get out of these endless wars. And you have mentioned that the fruit that's now bearing from the U.S. involvement in Afghanistan and all the efforts in Afghanistan to let democracy take root. There have not been many success stories. I was Condi Rice's economic deputy at the State Department, and that fervor to create space for democracy in the Muslim world seems to no longer be a priority for the U.S. Would you say that's true? And what concerns do you have about that?
Well, I would focus on what the Afghans want. Right? This is our democracy. It's what we want. And like I said, the discussions and the discourse on the Republic and our Constitution has been very strong and like never before. People realize what we have and what we want to preserve. So, and it's also not just democracy. It's also a way for us to sustain our institutions and continue. We are not a kingdom. And there has to be a way to transfer of power. There has to be reforms, absolutely, in the way we are governed. But overall, this is this is our system. It's not a system. It's not an American system.
Not an imposed system.
It's not an American system. So it's not about what America wants at this stage. It's about what Afghanistan wants, and what we are willing to protect and preserve. If the policy in the States has changed, it doesn't change the discourse or around governance in Afghanistan.
Thank you. So we're going to turn now to you. Please introduce yourself and your organization, and please no speeches, but questions. Thank you.
Joyce Layton Mitchell. I mainly work in U.S. education in China, but I'm interested in everywhere. I was thinking about the U.S. press, and I'm interested to hear what you think they have right about Afghanistan. And if you have enough time, what they might have wrong about Afghanistan.
It's a very good question. To begin with, they can spell the country. His name, and that's right. We're lucky that a lot of Americans have lived in Afghanistan over the last 20 years, and they've got to know our country well and our people well. So there is a lot of very good information on our country, and a lot of the reporting is very, very good, we have to say. But of course, many people don't have the kind of access they once did to the rural areas. When there was a huge American presence, they would embed with U.S. troops, go to the different provinces, talk to people. That is no longer available. There isn't such a high presence, U.S. presence, so their sources of information are limited. They have to rely on Afghan sources. So sometimes their information is lost in translation, and that can be frustrating. But overall, I would say that the press around Afghanistan in terms of information is accurate. It's unfortunate the way press works these days. It's all focused on the negativity. So if we were to build 100 bridges, it's not an extraordinary event, but if one was blown up by the Taliban, it becomes an event, and that is what gets reported. But that is how press works, not just in the US, in Afghanistan. We're frustrated with it. Overall, I would say we're very lucky that this partnership has produced a lot of good relations, and people still cover Afghanistan with a lot of enthusiasm, and we appreciate that work.
We'll come to it in a sec. We have 3 questions over the internet on Pakistan. So one mentions my interview with the Prime Minister of Pakistan last week here, saying that obviously he's a major player in all of these questions, and asking what the current state of relations is with Pakistan. Have they been helpful? What could they do to do more? And then we have a few others, but we'll take this one first.
Well, Pakistan is an interesting case when it comes to Afghanistan. They're our neighbor, and we can't do without them. But unfortunately, they also apply a foreign policy that is violent, and in support of proxy groups, in support of providing sanctuaries, supporting the ideology of those terrorists fighting, facilitating of the movement of some of those individuals who come to Afghanistan to fight, either Afghan refugees or foreign fighters. But it always says the right things. And so when we meet with them, they know exactly, they know how to charm their way in. The action part is one that we are waiting to see. We have had some good meetings with the Pakistanis in the last few months, but we're yet to see any impact of that on the ground. When the violence is reduced, I think it will open the door for much larger cooperation.
There was a question to the Pakistan Prime Minister of the split between the security forces and the political leadership in Pakistan, and that the security forces and reappointing the head of security, all of that sends the wrong signal, because that whole approach to harboring unstable actors or those who want to harm Afghanistan comes out of those security forces. Is that also your sense?
Well, we're still analyzing what Prime Minister Imran Khan said in the UN here when he was, because just before that, when we met them, they told us that this is the first time that Pakistani political administration and the military are on the same page, and they assured us time and again that that was the case, that they were speaking with one voice. So it came as a surprise that Prime Minister Imran Khan took stabs at the military at the UN. We're still assessing whether that was a strategy or that rifts have become more apparent.
Okay, and we'll have a question here, and then we have one there and there.
Charles Henderson, I'm an attorney. What gives you hope that the Taliban will sort of set aside what appears to be a violent streak within Afghanistan? And also, could you also comment about ISIS and those people that are in the various camps and what threat that poses to Afghan security?
Well, I'm not a believer of the Taliban's good intentions. I think they have to come to terms with the Afghan government, because they have to. They're running out of everything they had. This year, they brought everything they had to attack and try to take. They titled, or they named their offensive on this year as the victory. They have had no victories. They were hoping to take a few provinces around Kabul, put pressure on the citizens, economically, and all kind of surrender, push us to surrender. They have not had any luck with cities, let alone districts. And not just that, we have taken districts back from them. The Afghan security forces are getting really, really good. 4 offensives this year, 4 waves of attacks that the Taliban had. The last one was the elections. you might have seen, if you're following Afghanistan, the threats the Taliban made on the elections. They couldn't materialize any of that. Right? It was perhaps the most peaceful days, and some of the journalists even noticed that and reported on it, that it was perhaps the most peaceful time they have ever had in Kabul, whereas the Taliban's plan was large-scale attacks on Kabul, taking down polling centers and committing attacks to put fear into the people. And this year we have had a lot of these 4 waves of attacks. We noticed that they almost emptied all the madrasas in Pakistan, brought all the fighters in, and they didn't succeed. They attacked Kunduz. There were times where we were fighting them in 27 locations, and never did they succeed. Our forces, on the contrary, our casualty rates have dropped. When I started my job, our casualty rates were in the 50s and 60s on average. They have gone down to about 20 to 15. And now every life is important, and I wouldn't say that 15 is acceptable, but to drop from 60 to 20 is a huge drop. And on the contrary, the Taliban casualty rates have gone up. They cannot sustain this. They're losing their narrative. They have lost, let me say, they've lost their narrative. They were fighting to free Afghanistan from invaders, but they're having a hard time to explain to the Afghan people their relationship with their sponsors, Pakistan and other sponsors that are funding. So people are asking, and uneducated, unfortunate for them, the educated Afghanistan wants to know what is their relationship with Pakistan. Are they, and what's their independence? They cannot explain that. They're losing their narrative on Islam. Again, it's an Islamic republic. They're not able to sustain that. Militarily, they're defeated, right? And we're strengthening every day. So I think there is no choice left for the Taliban but to come to terms with the Afghan government and find a way to reconcile themselves.
What is the relationship between the Taliban and Pakistan?
Puppet. Proxies there. We don't think of Taliban as having any sort of independence. I know there will be people who disagree with that. I'm sure there are individuals in the Taliban who are naive enough to think that they're independent, but it's a proxy for an intelligence agency that controls everything they do.
So one of the questions here, if I could just divert for a second to this pile of questions, is about Pakistan's relationship and the Taliban's relationship to China. Do you see these things as linked, with the Taliban getting a warm reception recently in China?
Well, when we think about the conflict in Afghanistan, we have to think beyond the region. Right? The big power rivalries definitely impact us. We have not seen China use the Taliban or any other insurgents for malign activities in Afghanistan. Our analysis suggests so far of Chinese policy in Afghanistan is they want to see stability. They don't care who is in power in Afghanistan and what kind of government is in there. As long as they see a stable Afghanistan, that's not a threat to them. That's our assessment of what the Chinese think. Do they have a good relation with the Pakistanis, and are the Pakistanis using that to influence their policy? Perhaps. And knowing the Pakistanis, they would use any method to strengthen their proxy in Afghanistan and to give themselves an upper hand. And if they can use diplomatic efforts with the Chinese, I'm sure they would. But I think the Chinese are smart enough not to get sucked into Pakistan's, policy of using violence in Afghanistan, because I think they understand that it will come back and hurt themselves.
Thank you. We have a question here.
My name is Delane Brown, and you semi-answered my Taliban question.
Good.
Last July, I had two gentlemen for dinner, and both were involved with, very much involved with Afghanistan. It's kind of NGO sort of commitment. And they talked nonstop for 5 hours, and my function was to put food in front of them. My takeaway was that with the Pashtun tribal culture, some cultures are that you never tell a lie. Some cultures are save face. With the Pashtun culture, it seemed to be say anything. It doesn't matter what you say. You can lie fine. That just so how do you? The Doha talks were going on, so they were saying, "What's the use of this?" Because it doesn't matter what they say. They won't follow through, or they'll just say it doesn't matter. What is your take on that?
Well, I wouldn't make it ethnic. I am a Pashtun, and a lot of our security forces who are fighting the Taliban today are Pashtuns. This is a war between the Afghan people and those who are fighting or using terrorist activities to hurt our country and our people. I think, I'm, with all due respect to the people who you had for dinner, I'm sure they need to,
they obviously
get
were
themselves
not
a little update.
Yeah, obviously not Pashtun dinner mates. Yeah. Let's see. Yes. I'm sorry, right here, because he's been waiting, and then we'll come back to you. Next, yeah. No, here in the blue shirt, thanks.
Hello, I'm Hewat Khan. I'm an Afghan student at Columbia University. So I have two questions, but I will first ask the first one, and if you have the chance, I will ask the second one. So you just mentioned that the Taliban are a proxy for the Taliban, for the Pakistan intelligence. So isn't it that if we are even talking to the Taliban, legitimizing the Pakistan this action, like why don't we talk with the Pakistan directly, and how can we do that? Don't you think we should even stop the negotiation with the proxies, because it will not achieve the same thing? And
I agree with you.
And I'm sorry, could you just put your second question on the table, and then
do you want me to ask
yeah,
it?
Yeah,
Okay.
just ask it.
And the second question is about the negotiation, the so-called the peace negotiation that happened. Don't you think that it makes more sense if the Taliban directly talk with the Afghan government, and once the differences is ironed out, then the second phase will happen, the withdrawal of the US troop? It will make a lot of more sense. What do you think about that? Because I see that the structure was the opposite. The structure should have been the opposite way.
I agree with both of those statements. First of all, there is, on the first part, there is a discussion that I think the international community as a whole is ignoring, and that is the use of proxies. Right? I mean, the United Nations is a wonderful institution. It was built to prevent countries from going into regular combat, direct conflict with one another, and resolve that. But it didn't put in place measures to prevent proxy wars. And I think it needs to be a serious discussion now. Unfortunately, every country uses some sort of proxy, and so everyone is involved to an extent, and for that reason, maybe not taking it very seriously. But if we wish to see a stable world, the discussion of proxies need to be at the core of UN discussions here. The General Assembly, I think they need an entire General Assembly on that, or a Security Council. But on the second part, there can only be one discussion. There is no two phases to it, and that is Taliban and the Afghan government. If there is another phase which discusses the withdrawal of foreign troops, that has to be done by the Afghan government. We have a bilateral agreement with the United States, a bilateral security agreement. There is a framework in place for that. If the U.S. wishes to withdraw, they can give us a notice, and we can start working on that.
In the back here.
I am Raju. I'm a researcher You've spoken about China and Pakistan. Could you also speak about Afghanistan's relationship with Iran, particularly given what seems to be Iran's changing relationship with Taliban and, of course, the tensions between the U.S. and Iran? Thank you.
Well, Iran is a neighbor too.
You live in a complicated neighborhood.
Yeah, we do. Who doesn't?
Yes.
Well, Iran is a neighbor, and we can't avoid it. But when there is a conflict, many hands get involved, and some for their own protection, others for whatever reasons. And Iran's the part that has been better with Iran instead of Pakistan is that we have better relation with their government-to-government relation between Afghanistan and Iran has been on a much more mature level than that of with Pakistan. So we're able to resolve many of our issues that way. What impacts whether the U.S. and Iran relationship impact the Afghan-Iran relationship? Absolutely, of course it does. But it's something we're working to manage to make sure that it doesn't have a big impact, and credit must be given to the United States, and that they have also put work in to make sure that relationship doesn't get affected by giving sanctioned relief to, for example, Iran on Chabahar port for Afghanistan, the Afghanistan development. So we're all working to contain the escalating relationship between Iran and the U.S. not to impact Afghanistan.
So we have this one, and then we'll come to you right there. Yeah. Two. I'm sorry, the woman behind you, after you. That's fine. Go ahead. Go ahead, and then.
That's very kind of you. Thank you. My name is Manik Mehta. I am a journalist. Afghanistan is a landlocked country. How do you get access to ports to sustain your exports to major markets? Are you satisfied with Chabahar port? Also, what do you think about the closing of Gwadar for your import-export traffic?
Well, we have started to use a different term. We're a land-connected country, not a landlocked country. We connect South and Central Asia at this point. Yes, we once upon a time relied solely on Pakistan in their port of Karachi. But in the last 5 years, President Ghani had made deliberate efforts to expand our connectivity. We are now connected to even all the way to China by train through Uzbekistan, and all our neighbors are our port of connectivity. So we have access to all ports. We are connected to Europe through the Lapis Lazuli corridor from Turkmenistan. We are connected to Chabahar, and we still have access to the Karachi port. We have also extended our connectivity via air corridors. So a lot of our exports of light material now happen by air corridors to India and to the Middle East, GCC countries particularly, things like seasonal fruits and vegetables that go to those countries, plus saffron and others that can easily be carried. And so we have been opening air corridors. We are land connected to all our neighbors. And at this point, there is no way but to work with Afghanistan to connect South and Central Asia, and that has been a great success that we are very proud of.
So, to the woman here, and just to say, if we don't get to these questions, we're going to have to come back up here for the last 10 minutes. Speaking of saffron, Kashmir, and where that's all headed, Belt and Road, and where that's all headed. And I think we want to make sure we cover those.
Hi, my name is Fatma Rahmati. It's good to see you and have you back here. And I thought your answer was going to be the Afghan women inspire you the most. But my
Well, I
question,
don't discriminate. Afghans inspire me. Men and women, that's a distinction that we, yeah.
my question is according to reports, the last month was one of the highest of civilian casualties in the recent years, and more civilians died at the hands of, I guess, ally strikes and government forces as opposed to the Taliban. My question is, are there mechanisms of accountability for drone strikes, such as the 30 pine nut farmers who recently passed, drone strike by an ally, who is the US, and what is being done to reduce civilian casualties?
Well, civilian casualties are simply not acceptable. As a responsible government who abides by the rules of engagement, we're doing everything we can to avoid civilian casualties, not just ours, but also our partners who are engaged with us in multiple fights. Right? There is the counterinsurgency part that we fight against the Taliban. Then there is also the counterterrorism part where Al-Qaeda, Daesh and other elements are being fought with. And sometimes our partners also engage in offensive operations against those. Civilian casualties, like I said, is unacceptable. But I must also add that the Taliban are making it extremely hard to make that happen, because they're not abiding by any rules of engagement. They've taken our villages hostage, they've taken our mosques hostage, they've taken our guest houses, our hujras, all hostage. They use intimidation to enter into people's home and attack from those places. So the civilian casualties is largely because the Taliban have taken people hostage, and there is no distinction. They're not wearing uniforms. There is no distinction between where a civilian is. If there is so much so that a hint that we see a civilian among Taliban fighters, all operations are averted. In the last month, we were following one of the Taliban shadow governors for many days, for 6 days, and when we were about to, and when our security forces were about to strike, they identified a woman in there among them, and no permission was allowed. They checked back to see if they were allowed to take the hit. It wasn't permitted. So there is a lot of effort that goes into place when our army and resolute support forces take an action. When it came to some of those paramilitary groups or groups that were created by intelligence agencies and who perhaps didn't follow those strict rules, have also now been restricted. They've been told no action can be taken until it can be fully verified to make sure there are no civilians in the area. But I will use this opportunity to also call on the Taliban to stop using civilians as shields for their and stop using people's homes and mosques as places for as military bases for themselves.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for your time. My name is Erin McConlog. I work with Dale Carnegie. I'm curious, in the world where influence comes in many forms, what would you tweet if you knew that it hit everyone's phone in the whole world at the top of their vision? What topic would be the most important for us to see?
What topic would be the most? I guess humanity, right? Unfortunately, a country that has lived in a war for 4 decades, I feel like the blood of all humans is not equal, and we feel that pain on a daily basis. Humans are valued differently if they're richer. A poor country still has emotions and still has feelings and families, and those grievances will only grow. If we want to see peace in the world, we must see peace in the poorest parts of it too. Because those humans come back with grudges. A lot of the terrorists that we interrogate didn't just become terrorists, automatically. They carry a kind of grievance. But because they don't understand if there are other ways and solutions to it, they take up arms. If we were a little more humane, and paid attention to the feelings of all human beings, I think we would live in a safer world.
I think she's tweeting that right now. No. Yes. So you have a question from online. It says, I apologize if this is a bit too general, but what are your thoughts regarding the growing trend of my country first, America first, Britain first, the populist movements? I ask because for Afghanistan, I think some more populism and nationalism is sorely needed.
Well, Afghanistan first.
The first.
You know, in politics, there is a general term that says all politics is local. Right? It's very true. It's always local. We first think about ourselves, our country, or we start with our families and then go big. It's one thing for Afghanistan to do that. It's another when your responsibilities are larger. Right? We have a responsibility to our people, our country, and perhaps even our neighbors where we have influence. But those countries who wield a lot more influence are able to define the futures of other countries, I think have to think bigger because their responsibilities are bigger.
And Barney, I'm going to come to you, our wonderful introducer, to see if you have any question after I ask this next one. So on the Belt and Road, I interviewed the Prime Minister of Thailand, who said they're very concerned with the Belt and Road. I mean, they welcome it, but concerned about sovereignty issues. So they have been able to negotiate land rights, keeping the land rights, keeping the workforce primarily Thai. All of these things. Could you talk about Afghanistan's approach to the Belt and Road and what you welcome and what you might be concerned about?
Well, when it comes to sovereignty, Afghanistan takes it very seriously. We have been fighting for our sovereignty for 4 decades. Close to 1.5 million people have died to protect our freedoms in the last 40 years. So it is very important, but when it comes to questions like that, I think it drills down to the legal questions and being able to protect yourself legally. We got into a mining contract that we didn't fully understand, and one of the reasons we have taken a step back from our mining contracts and issuing large mining contracts is because big countries like the U.S., China, Russia, they have they understand the legal lingo and can easily manipulate smaller countries like Afghanistan who may not have that capacity. So we took a step back. We reevaluated our mining law and all other regulations before we can get back into start negotiating or contracting out the mineral wealth of Afghanistan. And the same applies to our contracts, initiatives that will use Afghanistan to connect it with other countries. We think our biggest asset there is our location. So we think Afghanistan can be able to, a land bridge between South and Central Asia and connect that connectivity. Financially benefiting or economically benefiting all of the region. So we are very interested in connectivity of all sorts, but we are wary and looking into how that happens. And our revival of our legal codes have been to protect ourselves from that.
So just to understand, you don't yet have a signed agreement on a Belt and Road project?
No.
Okay.
No.
Anything from you? Here's a mic, yep.
Well, thank you for the unexpected opportunity. The last time I asked you a question at the Asia Society, you commented that I asked difficult questions.
That's why we kept you for last year.
But I just can't help myself, so I hope you'll forgive me.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Okay. You mentioned that all countries have proxies.
Mm-hmm.
That is also true of the United States. And I talked to many of the neighbors of Afghanistan, and as you know much better than I am sure, some of the governments of the neighbors of Afghanistan think that you are a proxy for the United States. Not you personally, but your government is a proxy for the United States. And they feel threatened by the United States. And that is one of the many causes of the external factors in the conflict in Afghanistan today. And I'm not mainly talking about Pakistan in this case. How do you, yet, and the United States is far from Afghanistan, and landlocked or then the United States is not land linked to Afghanistan. It requires linkages through those other countries to get there. How do you envision the long-term, medium to long-term relations of the United States and Afghanistan, and what do you tell your neighbors who are very unhappy with the relations between Afghanistan and the United States?
Well, our neighbors are not really concerned about us being a proxy for the United States now. What they're worried about is what the U.S. has plans for the future, and not for the immediate, because we are not a threat to any of our neighbors. There has been no threat emanating from Afghanistan outside of our borders to impact any of those countries. If they were, would be in a difficult place. But I think it's the potential of what they think can possibly happen. Having a country in a very critical location, our location is it can also be a curse, and how it can impact if there was long-term U.S. presence without any conditions. But I think those concerns are undue. We have a very serious bilateral security agreement that defines U.S. role in Afghanistan for the time being. And over a longer period, if we were to have a U.S. presence, it will also be defined on what that is, and in a very transparent manner, where those agreements are ratified by our, the bilateral security agreement with the U.S. was ratified by our parliament, by Loya Jirga, and by our Senate. Not just, so it wasn't a decision that was taken in secrecy. And from what I understand in the questions we got here today as well, the U.S. doesn't want to stay in Afghanistan. It's fatigued. It wants to get out. So I think those countries who wish to see the U.S. leave should help us get to stability faster. And as for dealing with proxies, I think the best way of dealing with this, from where I sit, is by strengthening our own security forces so that they cannot threaten us anymore, and we can provide security to all our people throughout the country, and we are on the path to doing that.
Do you feel the timeline for U.S. exit is definitely being squeezed, like you're going to have to adjust to a different kind of timeline? And I know there's quite a bit of bitter history in Afghanistan of the way countries have withdrawn, or a sense of abandonment, that wasn't fully negotiated or understood, and some obsession at the moment in Afghanistan with the U.S. withdrawal from Vietnam and what that means, and looking at lessons from past history. What are you more worried about, a precipitous U.S. exit that would not be well prepared?
Look, in Afghanistan, every country is, of course, a result of its what happened, of its history. And in Afghanistan, every time a foreign troop force has withdrawn, it has destroyed our country. And the British in the First, Second, and Third Anglo-Afghan War destroyed Kabul after every defeat. The Russians, after their withdrawal, we had a civil war, and it left literally nothing in the country. So yes, we are concerned if the U.S. is to have a precipitous withdrawal. What would the result be? Another civil war? For that reason, we think that this can be done responsibly. and we can help with that. The Afghans want to be in control of our own destiny anyway, and as people who are freedom loving, we have no issue with the U.S. withdrawing. And all we asked before, and we continue to ask, is that that negotiation happen with the Afghan government, and we work on a plan, a time plan, on what can be done. That said, we're also preparing for that scenario if the U.S. was to decide tomorrow that it's going to withdraw. On what is it that we need to do to be prepared so that we don't enter a civil war. So that scenario is actually being worked, as we speak too.
There's been quite a bit of speculation and debate here. What happened with the Camp David meeting with the Taliban, and why was that canceled, and what was President Trump seeking to achieve? What is your understanding of that and the status of these talks with the Taliban?
I think it's a question that to ask a U.S. official. From our perspective, we were invited and we were prepared to go because we think that it would have been a good opportunity to talk to U.S. Policymakers at the highest level, speaking to the president directly. So from our aspect, we were prepared to go and have a real discussion. As for its cancellation, the reasons that were stated in the media were the reasons given to us too.
Okay, so Kashmir, one would think you have enough on your plate, but this also would affect Afghanistan quite a lot, and this conflict between India and Pakistan. Could you explain your view of Kashmir and why is that troublesome for you, or what would you hope to happen there?
Well, we were unhappy that the Pakistanis tried to drag Afghanistan into the Kashmir issue. It's a bilateral issue between Pakistan and India. To drag Afghanistan and threaten that they will continue violence in our country is, I think, irresponsible. If Pakistan has issues with India, I think it's better that they address them directly.
So to end, I'd like to just ask you to articulate for us what your main message to the American people would be now as we enter an election, as Afghanistan has been a major subject in the presidential debates. What are you hoping to see from leaders stepping up to the plate in America, and what is your main appeal to them?
Well, my main message to the Americans would be, as I've always done, is to thank you for your help and support in helping us recover from destruction to today having institutions and opportunities in our country and an economy, a place where Afghans can hope for a better future. I would also say that Afghanistan is not a burden on the United States. What we have built together will help us maintain stability in our country. There is a path to peace and stability, and that path can be achieved if we were to work together and honestly and directly. And we are working on that. I think we are working on rebuilding our country for our sake, but what you benefit from it is to have a strong partner in that region who will always be grateful for the support that you have provided. You can walk away and leave Afghanistan and leave a country that would remain your friend, but there is also a risk that if this was not done right, that you would leave people who may feel very bitter about how it all ended.
Thank you. Join me in thanking His Excellency. Thank you so much.